Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Ivan Krastev and I'm one of the permanent fellows. This is not me singing now. Of the Institute. This is one of the political salons that we're doing together with Die Presse, but this is one of a special series that we started together with Time to Talk. And this is a special series because basically we're not simply interested in an issue, but we're also interested in the intellectual evolution of the person that we have invited. And from this point of view, I'm really very happy to introduce our guest. David Goodhart, probably you're here because you know who he is and not because you don't know. But intellectually, I do believe this is one of the important things that is happening in the European debate. Very well-known author, journalist, sociologist, public intellectual. He was the publisher and the founder of Prospect, probably one of the most interesting and influential journal of ideas in the United Kingdom in English language. He published an article. Probably he's going to write a bit about the migration and basically trying to challenge certain ideas about diversity, which was so much critically attacked that it pushed him to write a book. And I do believe his book ended with something very important. Probably not everybody of you has read the book, but you have heard somewhere that the major divide in our societies today is between people from somewhere and people from anywhere. So this is the person who invented this.
Actually?
No.
I know. Well,
okay, yeah. But what was for us extremely important when we started this, and we started with Gisela Stewart the previous time, is so you have somebody. This position of being critical towards migration or diversity is not a new position. What was interesting and new is that this much more sophisticated reading comes from somebody who started as a criticism from within the liberal community. This is not a kind of a classical type of people who never like this and believe that never is going to be there. And personally, I find this book extremely important and the debate about the book very important. So this is going to be our pleasure with Christian to start the discussion. And first the idea is that you in 15 minutes present your major argument.
Oh, okay.
And then basically we're going to the professional.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ivan. And Ivan actually was responsible partly, at least for one of the labels in my Anywhere, Somewhere distinction, because I had been thinking, we share a literary agent, and I think it was in a conversation relayed by our literary agent to me. I think you'd read my book proposal and you said, and my categories had been somewheres and nowheres, and you said, no, make it somewheres and anywheres. And so you have played a very important part in the book, because anywheres is much more accurate than nowheres actually. Anyway, let me just describe briefly the thesis of the book. It's called The Road to Somewhere, and it's really about the value divides in British society. It's mainly focused on Britain, although I write about America and about continental Europe as well. And I think some of the general argument does apply in other countries, albeit in slightly different form. And I guess it is really, the book is trying to understand the kind of pushback against the last 25, 30 years of what one might call the double liberalism, the economic liberalism and the social and cultural liberalism. I think there are various dates just to remind ourselves of how much has changed and how much more open our societies have become economically and socially and culturally. You just have to go back to 1992, I think is a crucial year. It was the year when, is it the year that Clinton was elected or came to power?
Yeah, 1992 was Clinton.
So it was also the year of the Maastricht Treaty, in which the European Union took a whole new big step towards a more post-nationalist future. We had the beginnings of the euro, but we also had the creation of the European citizen. But we also had in America, and therefore a little bit later in Britain, as is often the case, we had the left, the very loosely defined left in politics. We had the Democrats, actually quite a left figure in the Democratic Party. Robert Reich wrote his famous book, The Something of Nations. It wasn't The Wealth of Nations, The Work of Nations. The Work of Nations. In which he basically talked about how globalization should be regarded as something to be welcomed in many ways. It did have distributional effects, but addressing the kind of the sort of blue collar base of the Democratic Party, he was saying, don't worry, we'll roll with globalization and we'll look after you. You know, we'll turn all you steel workers into IT technicians. New Labour said something very, very similar in Britain a few years later, and of course it didn't happen. The only places in the world where it has happened, I think, is actually Germany, or what we might call the Germanic countries, partly because of Mitbestimmung and social plans and so on. If you make a lot of people redundant in Germany, and it's probably the same here in Austria, you do actually have to retrain people, but you don't have to in Britain and America, and we didn't. Anyway, so just going back to 92, we then had 2001, China joins the WTO. We had the euro, we had EU, we had the former communist countries joining in 2004 and having immediate access to the labour market, in Britain at least, Britain, Sweden and Ireland. And then we've had, more recently, of course, we've had the financial crisis 2008, the refugee crisis 2015, and we've had the drip rise in the populist vote, in so-called populist vote in many European countries, Brexit, Trump. So I mean, my book is partly trying to understand and explain the shift in politics from essentially up until 10, 15 years ago. We still thought of politics as essentially socio-economic, about the basic unit was still social class, however fuzzy class was becoming. It was about arguments about market v state, size of the public sector, and so on. And that kind of politics is obviously, that left-right politics is obviously still here, but it has been kind of it's been partly eclipsed, you might say, by socio-cultural politics. The security and identity issues have emerged very strongly to challenge the old socio-economic politics in some ways. And this hasn't just come out of the blue. It hasn't come, it's not because of the charismatic, the power of Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen or whoever the modern version of Jörg Haider is. It's because of people's, rational, if you like, reactions to big changes in our society, big openings in our society. And the reaction has also been partly to do with the emergence of a great sort of value schism in our society that I describe in using these labels: the people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere. Just to unpack those categories a little bit more, I mean, when I talk about the people from anywhere, I don't mean the elite. The elite are a subset of the anywheres. It's the only argument I had with Axel's interview with me the other day is he kept talking about the eliten. The anywheres are people who are highly educated, by which I mean basically graduates or more. They are, particularly in Britain, less so in continental Europe and America, but particularly in Britain, going to university means leaving home. It means changing your network of connections in life. which partly explains the anywhere worldview, I think. So the combination of being well educated, being mobile, and the combination of those two things tends to make people, not in every individual case, but as a rule, makes people more open. They place great stress on openness, autonomy. They're generally happy with social change. They like novelty. They're generally confident about the world, partly because the world is designed by and for people like them. So they can take social change confidently in their stride. And like I say, this is. I mean, there are subsets. I mean, the anywhere is a big baggy category, but there are certainly people who would count as the elite. There's a small subset I call the global villagers, about 3-5% of the population. Against the anywheres, you have the people who see the world from somewhere, who are a kind of mirror image in some ways, although they're a much larger proportion of the population, about 50%, and they tend to not be so well educated and to be much more rooted, to value security and familiarity perhaps more than the anywheres, to be more wary of social change, to be small c conservative. Now, not everybody, not every individual conforms again to this combination of views and attitudes, but as a general rule, that is the case. So the two big differences between anywheres and somewheres, I would say, are in attitudes to social change and in attitudes to group attachment. Anywheres, by dint of their biographies, often have quite weak group attachments. They no longer are attached to the place that they come from and the kinds of people that they grew up with. And somewheres are still attached to places and people like themselves, and that means they tend to be much more comfortable with. Indeed, it forms a much more important part of the backdrop to their lives, group attachments, both big, abstract, kind of national attachments, but also kind of local attachments. Incidentally, a similar divide, I only discovered while I was writing the book, was a divide that maps onto my divide rather well, was one invented by the otherwise enormously boring sociologist Talcott Parsons. I don't know if anyone here has had to read Talcott Parsons. He was the American functionalist sociologist who wrote these great sort of chemistry textbooks of sociology. But he did come up with this very useful, talking about human identities, he came up with this very useful distinction between achieved and ascribed identities. And I think that it's a very useful and illuminating distinction. So my anywheres are overwhelmingly, we're all on a spectrum, and we all have both ascribed and achieved identities, but anywheres, the achieved part of their identity towers over the ascribed part. So their sense of themselves with an achieved identity comes from what they have done in their lives. I mean, what they've achieved. They've passed exams when they were at school, they've gone to more or less good universities, they have more or less successful professional careers, so they have a sense, often rather an elevated sense, of their own kind of self-invention. I suppose I should say, our. Whereas somewheres tend to have much more identities that are ascribed to them. I mean, the things you can't escape. I'm white, male, British. Things about me, I mean, unless I have a sex change operation, those things are going to remain true throughout my life. And an ascribed identity, often, or a predominantly ascribed identity, means that you tend to be more discomforted by change to where you come from. If your identity is connected to where you live and the group you come from, then if those things change, I don't know, because a whole lot of East Europeans come and live in your neighborhood, that affects your sense of who you are in a way that if you're sense of who you are comes from passing exams and your professional career and so on, you're less affected by those things. They bounce off you, and you can live anywhere, which is why it's such a good word. Thank you, Ivan. Anyway, I'll hurry up. I mean, now a lot of people say, "Oh, but this is so binary. Anywheres and somewheres. Life's much more complicated than that." Well, of course, life is much more complicated than that. And actually, as writers tiresomely say, if you buy my book and read it, you will see that there is actually. I mean, I do talk about the distinctions within these two large blocks, and there's also a big group of people I call the Inbetweeners. I don't particularly talk very much about them, it's true, but there's a group, about 25% of the population, who have an almost equally divided worldview, both anywhere and somewhere. I also just want to emphasize, I invented the labels with a bit of help, but I didn't invent the value groups. They really are there in the data, as the academics like to say. If you look at things like the British Social Attitude Surveys, I mean, then the whole reams of opinion and attitude surveys, and if you interrogate them in a certain way, you'll come up with roughly these kinds of proportions for the worldview that I'm describing. And of course, the other important thing to emphasize is that both of these worldviews are entirely, in their mainstream forms anyway, entirely decent and legitimate. They just happen to conflict in really rather fundamental ways in terms of life, political priorities. So let me just quickly move on to the issue of kind of why this has emerged so much more now. I mean, I touched on that earlier. It's, I think, partly in response to the Brexit Trump populism is partly a somewhere response to feeling excluded from the political process, the feeling that anywhere domination has been so total in our societies, just in the last 20 years or so, that a large proportion of somewheres, at least in Britain, stopped voting. I don't know what the position is here, but I think about 3 million people who voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit referendum had not voted in the preceding 5 or 6 general elections because they thought, and with some reason, there's no point voting because I will end up with a government of anywheres. They wouldn't have used that phrase, because they agree on the broad sort of liberal worldview. They want an open economy. They're comfortable with immigration. They think the knowledge economy is a wonderful thing. Obviously, the knowledge economy that benefits highly educated people. They are part of. This is a theme that we could perhaps come back to. I think the whole domination in our society by cognitive elites, the way in which a certain, you might say, quite narrow form of human aptitude, cognitive ability, has come to be seen as the kind of gold standard of human esteem, and other virtues, character, virtue, Christian virtue, emotional intelligence, often things that we associate with the private realm of traditional female values, even of kind of nurture and care and so on, have been somewhat diminished as cognitive ability has kind of swept all before it, and I think left a lot of people feeling diminished too. We've seen in education, we've seen throughout the developed world, particularly in Britain, I think a massive expansion of higher education. Universities are the anywhere institutions par excellence. So anywheres who rule our societies have, surprise, decided to massively increase their number while continuing this isn't such an issue here, but the historic neglect of technical and vocational education has continued in Britain. I think the other important thing is the way in which what one might call technocratic depoliticization has happened in all our societies. I think probably again, maybe more acutely in the UK, by which I mean more and more things have been taken out of the everyday democratic contest. Now that is partly a function, you might say a necessary function of globalization WTO rules on, I don't know, you know, on GM crops, or on you know, whole issues relating to risk, which is you know, different societies have different attitudes towards risk. You know, Austrians tend to be a bit more risk averse than Brits on certain aspects of insurance policies and things. And you know, this is kind of an important part of our different national identities. But all of these things get sort of homogenized necessarily in some ways as a result of globalization. So you have WTO rules that take a whole lot of things outside, or things that used to be part of the kind of everyday democratic contest. They're removed. The European Union itself obviously takes a huge number of things out of the everyday democratic contest, you know, including immigration as a result of free movement. And that had a particular impact. Obviously, one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why we voted for Brexit was because of free movement. And just in brackets here, I mean, I would say it's not because British people are more xenophobic than people in other countries. Obviously, free movement has been happening in other big economies too. The reason why it is so important in Britain is essentially because of the Margaret Thatcher reforms to our labour market. We have a very flexible labour market. So people, indeed our whole growth model, you might say, in the last 30 years has essentially been flexible labour market plus very, very high levels of labour market participation. I think it's now up to sort of 78% or something, topped up by very high immigration. That is our growth model. And it has, it means we have a kind of, you might even say, a kind of outsider benefiting kind of economic structure. And you can see that actually, remarkable graph. If you look at what's happened, the divergence between GDP growth and GDP per capita growth, which is obviously the only thing that really matters. GDP growth is just, you know, in Britain's case, often just an expression of higher population. And there's a real fascinating chart which shows how the two have, you know, been pretty much the same through the 80s and the 90s. And then in 2005, not coincidentally, they start doing that. Anyway, so free movement, I mean, it was both on a very much, we accepted it before all the other big economies. It was on a much larger scale. And also it is in the nature of our economy, and indeed you might say in our welfare system. We have a very open labour market. We have a very open welfare system. So free movement has impacted people in Britain much more than, you know, in France, Germany. You know, Germany has, you know, similar numbers, but because of different labour market regulations, it impacts the average worker much less, I would argue. Yeah. So but the sort of that end of bracket. I'll just finish on this point. The technocratic depoliticisation, I think, is a hugely important part of the story here. More and more things have been taken out of the democratic contest. WTO things, EU things, including pretty existentially important things like, you know, your immigration policy was taken out of the democratic contest. Of course, and we've also been taking things out of the democratic contest ourselves. We made the Bank of England independent in 1997. It's been doing massively important political economy things in recent years with, you know, huge quantitative easing, which has huge distributional implications. That is outside of politics. We've had the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights, the Human Rights Act, that one of the things Labour did in the early 2000s or the late 90s. That has helped that's created much more judicial activism. So that in a whole range of things, the democratic forum, if you like, has shrunk in all of our countries, I think, and perhaps particularly in Britain. And anywhere's are relatively okay about that. I mean, I think it's partly to do with, you know, if you're doing okay in life, you know, if your own, you don't worry so much about national sovereignty if you have a fair amount of sovereignty in your own life, both sort of privately and professionally. a lot of people who are perhaps more in the kind of political journalistic elite, they kind of understand or certainly believe very strongly that states can no longer be governed in the way that used to be at the national level. So we have to. It's rational, and indeed it's kind of in some way empowering to push these powers into upwards into different places. They see the logic of it, and there is of course a logic to it, and they might even have a friend of a friend who works at the OECD, or they get that things can't just be done at the national level any longer, but to much of the rest of society it's seen as disempowering, that one of the few things you have as an ordinary citizen on a not very decent wage is your vote. It's the one place where we are all equal. That democratic lever has been becoming a lot weaker, and people have become very aware of it, particularly when something as dramatic as 2005, 13,000 East Europeans were meant to come, in fact, 1.5 million came over the next 3 or 4 years. Something as existential as that just reminds people or presents to people something they hadn't perhaps realized, is how disempowered they have become in their own societies. As I say, partly because of that overreach, the overdominance of the anywhere worldview that we're now seeing the pushback from. Anyway, well, I'll stop there. I mean, I do want. I mean, the final chapter in my book is about what do we do about this? I'm not just describing the schism. I mean, I am trying to come up, although I do think it's the weakest chapter in the book. I call it the new settlement. How can we find ways of bringing these two worldviews together, or finding the common ground between them, so that we can move forward as societies. And I think a lot of that is about anywheres becoming more aware of their power, is the sort of first step, and then acknowledging perhaps that they have had too much of it, and that the policy, which will always obviously be essentially kind of run by anywheres, needs to take account of the priorities and the anxieties of the people that I call the people from somewhere. I'll stop there.
Well, yeah. Thanks a lot.
Right.
David, if you may allow, I would like to start with a personal question.
Yeah.
In your book, which I really enjoyed reading, you mentioned that writing an essay in 1997 was somehow a turning point in your thinking. You mentioned that you wrote an article where you dared to pose the question, are we too diverse? And obviously, after that, you witnessed some ancient form of a shitstorm. So I would like to know, because to me you seem like a prototype of an anywhere.
No, well, I am.
So what drove you away to a certain degree from your liberal tribe?
It was actually a little bit later. It was 2004, I think. It was. I wrote it in 2003. It was published in 2004, and I mean, it was very, very innocent. I mean, I was genuinely interested in. In fact, there's a man called David Willits who's been a politician, rather a good politician, a conservative, very thoughtful conservative politician. He was a relatively junior figure in the Cameron government, and is now in the House of Lords. And he's at Prospect magazine, the magazine I set up and used to edit. We used to have these round table debates, and people would come together and talk about. And David Willits came and spoke at one on welfare and welfare reform, and he talked about something which it never really occurred to me before, and I became very interested. He was basically talking about how there's a trade-off in welfare states between high levels of kind of cultural, I mean, not necessarily ethnic, but often it will be ethnic, cultural homogeneity, a kind of recognition of shared fate, shared history, and so on. People are more likely to be ready to share with each other, to share with people in that society. And so it's no coincidence that the high welfare state spending societies tend to have been relatively homogeneous ones. The Scandinavians are often cited, and in more diverse societies. And in fact, Willett's made the contrast between Sweden become a lot less homogeneous since he spoke, actually, and America. You can either have Sweden, where you have high homogeneity and high welfare sharing, or you can have America, where you have much greater diversity and much lower propensity to share. And it seemed to me a kind of one of those statements of the obvious that I'd never really thought of before, but seemed to be a really interesting subject. So I spent a year or so sort of thinking about it and reading things, and then I wrote this essay, which was essentially about that, exploring that theme, as you say, called Too Diverse. And it was the fact that it was reprinted in the Guardian newspaper, the main liberal newspaper in Britain, and that did cause...
What was the reaction like?
I was called a racist, a nice powerlite, in reference to Enoch Powell, various other things, and yeah, I did feel persecuted, not in any sort of particularly serious way, but it was an uncomfortable experience, but it also it sort of gave me a career as well. I then I got invited to countless seminars and conferences on race and immigration, issues I'd never really had very much interest in before. But I became an expert pretty quickly, and this was the time when the BBC was I think under a lot of fire. This was the time when we'd had very, very short history of post-war British immigration. So we'd had people had come from the Commonwealth. We'd had an open door, much as free movement requires it in the European Union. We'd had an open door between 1948 and 1962 for people in the Empire and the Commonwealth. So I mean, in theory, 700 million people around the globe could have come to Britain and enjoyed full British citizenship rights. Some of them came and didn't then get their papers, which is why we're having this so-called Windrush argument at the moment in Britain. Windrush is the name of the boat that some of them came on in 1948. Anyway, so we had that. A whole lot of people came then. Actually, about 500,000 people came. I think the authorities had thought, nobody would come. That you could kind of have an open door policy, and despite the fact that we now had a kind of quite a decent welfare state, the people from some of the poorest countries in the world wouldn't want to come to Britain. There was rather extraordinary sort of assumptions were made. Anyway, about 500,000 of them did come, and that caused some racial friction. And later on in the 60s, there was quite a lot of aggro. We had Enoch Powell and his famous Rivers of Blood speech that we've just been celebrating the 50th anniversary of. But we kind of, we got used to being a multi-ethnic society. By the late 80s, early 90s, the visible minority population was probably 6 or 7%.
You felt that it was not allowed to criticize these developments or analyze it. Or
yes, but just because at that moment the society was starting to get anxious about the subject again. So we had that first wave of post-colonial immigration. The numbers then came down because Parliament could respond to people's anxieties, and did respond. So there was a kind of trade-off. We will have decent equality laws, race discrimination laws that will clamp down on racism, but we will keep an eye on, we'll make sure the numbers don't get too high. And that is what happened. But then 97 comes and you have the new Labour government and the doors are opened again. You get a really dramatic increase. And then 2004, we have the opening to Eastern Europe. So I wrote this piece into an atmosphere that was getting quite tense on the subject. So a lot of people were kind of ready to abuse me because I was just raising questions and I was fingering something that was particularly sensitive on the left. I mean, I was essentially saying to the left, to the centre left, that the two principles that you hold most dear, diversity and solidarity, are actually in conflict, or at least you have to worry about the tension between the two of them. And if you don't, there's going to be trouble.
If you may allow one more question, because I really found it interesting. You said that part of the problem is so-called depoliticization of the debates or of the politics. I found that interesting in a way because immediately Angela Merkel popped up in my head because in many incidents she talked of political decisions being without any alternative.
Right,
so she called it alternative laws.
Yeah.
And even before that, starting in the 90s, there were many arguments like this, that something is without any alternative, that the political room for maneuvering is shrinking and shrinking. In German it was called Sachzwang, Logik. And what I want to ask you is, do you think that somehow the anywheres, the liberals, whatever you may call them, stopped explaining what they are doing, stopped asking questions, became maybe a little bit too dogmatic?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good way of putting it. And in a sense, I was a kind of victim of that dogma at the time. And that made me, in fact, that's perhaps why I've come to write this book. I mean, having that experience made me very aware of the fact that, my liberal tribe, as it were not expressing some kind of neutral, eternal values. They were just as partisan and prejudiced as the people they thought of as the conservatives or the nativists or whatever. And I think that's exactly right. And that, in a sense, is still what I'm trying to argue. And what I argue in The Road to Somewhere is that when you take anywheres regard their own political priorities as fact, as neutral, so there is no alternative. Tina, as we call it in our politics. What people mean by that is, there is no alternative to the anywhere worldview, and you can bet your bottom dollar. I mean, when these different aspects of economics or politics are taken out of the democratic sphere and are decided by committees of experts in one place or another, you can bet your bottom dollar that they will be decided according to the priorities of anywheres. It'll be about economic openness, non-discrimination, internationalism, whatever. And these things are not neutral. I mean, they may be right.
You could argue that they benefit the majority of society.
Well, and you're right. But they haven't made the argument. And the majority of society, or at least a big minority, is saying it's not benefiting us. Actually, you're doing all these things, claiming that this is going to be good for the kind of median person, but actually we don't think it is very good. So could we please have our democratic accountability back? Which is what the Brexit vote was about, in a way. National identity and national democratic accountability. Because the EU has been kind of anywhereism, writ large. And the somewheres have said, and this is not because, I mean, there are some somewheres who are xenophobes and authoritarians. There's no denying that. Perhaps 5-7% of the somewhere bloc I would characterise as that, but they are not bad people. and this is, you know, the moralism of not all anywheres, but the kind of more extreme anywheres, the belief that not only their policies are more functional in a modern globalized world, but they are morally superior to the intuitions and priorities of somewheres. And I think somewheres find this the kind of, you know, the straw that breaks the camel's back. I mean, not only do they have to put up, you know, with, you know, your factory closes and goes to China because of globalization. Okay, you can just about put up with that. They then import a whole alternative labor force from Eastern Europe to compete with you in your own country. You know, it's the kind of double whammy. You can perhaps even put up with that. But when then some bugger in London tells you that all of this is somehow morally superior, you do get a little bit cross, I think, or at least I would if I was a somewhere. But I think you're right that there's been, you know, a laziness, or, you know, because of that, you know, I became very sensitized to the anywhere worldview, and I think many anywheres still don't really see it as a worldview. They just see it as common sense, morally superior common sense.
I don't see a coherent somewhere worldview. I mean, it's somehow hard to find one. It's right. You in your book, you on several parts of your book, you write about somewhere intuition. I mean, an intuition, it's not really, it's what's common people.
Well, true. Anyways, have intuition. We all have intuition.
But it's not a coherent worldview.
What I do say is that I think the somewheres are, on the whole, I invent this phrase, decent populists. And what I mean by decent populist is that they, you know, they don't like a lot of the changes that have happened in our societies over the last 20, 25 years. But they have, on the whole, gone along with the great liberalisation. They have gone along with the great, and it's there in the attitudes data on race, on gender, on sexuality. They have accepted it. It's not, perhaps, you know, it's not, these things are not, you know, the equalities and the struggle to become a more culturally equal society in those areas are not necessarily somewhere priorities, but they have accepted, and often they live equality, often certainly in terms of race equality, much more than many anywheres who tend to live in areas of quite low minority population. But yeah, I mean, somewheres are, you know, by definition, you know, a group that doesn't produce manifestos.
Yes.
And, you know, it's responsive and reactive. I mean,
would you agree that one last question? Would you agree that somehow the massive immigration was a more important driver of these populist or tendencies, or this shift, or this revolt, or whatever you may call it, than globalization?
Well, the two
because to me it seems globalization for most of the people it's abstract. It's a rather abstract concept.
Or it's cheaper phones.
Yeah, but immigration is obviously not.
Yeah, I mean, you might say it's part of the opening we associate with globalization. But yes, I mean, it comes back down, and I think this is what made me a kind of stranger in my own liberal tribe, is that I think I did kind of come to intuit some of the things that many kind of ordinary people in our societies do intuit. They do not think of society as a random collection of individuals. And at some level, many, not all, but many anywheres think of societies as random collections of individuals. They are not. They are made up of groups. Societies are made up of groups, essentially. And group attachment, you know, that feeling of sort of pride or shame in your country, that a feeling of kind of belonging to a certain, you know, a certain locality or a certain type of person, like the type of person that you grew up with, gives you a sort of, You know, you can feel society sort of in your stomach in a way that you go to university and you cease to feel that in some way. Now, you may say that feeling society in your stomach sounds slightly kind of disturbing thing, you know, and it could lead to you know, nativism and xenophobia, and it can, but it doesn't have to. And I think in most cases, like I say, most somewheres are decent populists. They are not, you know, that. I think a very annoying illusion that people that anywhere anti, you know, people writing about populism often talk about how such and such a populist party or indeed an individual are hostile to immigrants. I think that is very rarely the case. People are hostile to mass immigration and the effects that it has on them economically, culturally perhaps, in the sense of their neighbourhood changing too fast, but they will very rarely be hostile to individual immigrants. Indeed, will often have immigrants or people from minority backgrounds as friends. So I think, but they do have a sense of that there is such a thing as society, and the more educated you are, the more mobile you've been in your own country, and perhaps you've lived abroad, and you sort of cease to have such a strong attachment to a society, and what's more is that you're suspicious of people that do. So I want to say you can have strong group attachments and still have perfectly decent liberal instincts about the world, and I think, you know, this distinguishes me from most kind of anywhere analysis that is suspicious of. I think you can have group attachments and be strong group attachments even, and be perfectly decent and non-nativist, and I think it's a really important it's an important point to make, I think, and anyway.
Yes. To audience, I have only one question. And first of all, this is a very important position because psychologically it has been proved that people can change their views only on the basis of the arguments that come from somebody who belongs to their group. So from this point of view, you're in a very powerful position. And there was a lot of study. Sunstein and others have been very much showing this. And this is the power of the dissenting voices. The same argument coming from somebody with whom you cannot identify, you're simply dismissing. So, but here's the story. What you're telling is the story of a kind of anywhere who has a sense of roots. This was the aristocrats. They were very cosmopolitan, but they have their estate. And they're very much kind of committed to this. I'm saying to this because in a certain way I do believe, like Christian, that your book is extremely important exactly for the debate within the liberal community, because there's certain type of assumptions and so on. And Piketty had a beautiful study which was recently done showing how the voting has changed in the 10% of the richest people. This is about wealth, not about incomes. And his major argument is now the left and right simply represent two different elites. The left is the elite of the educated. The right is the weight of the wealth, not the income, but the wealth. And from this point of view, people basically don't feel any type of a representation. But my interesting story is the following. Because the liberal elite is much more discursive, because they're university and so on, you can have this conversation. What kind of a position is going to change the perspective of the somewheres? Because somewheres is also going to try to view the world that is going to change. Because otherwise it's going to be simply nostalgic. You're not going to return it where it was. You can have a gut in the stomach, but the world is changing. You're not going to stop migration totally. Nevertheless, that I do believe your example was great, that at the moment when you basically manage to control it and to digest it in 1962 to 1980s, it's a totally different type of a problem. So my story is, to what extent this is a symmetrical or asymmetrical situation? To what extent on the conservative side, you're going to see somebody like you, which is part of the tribe, who is saying, listen, we were right to believe that anywheres cannot simply ignore the politics of the normal people. And when you talk about the primacy of the politics, This is one of the famous titles of a book about the emergence of social democracy in the 20th century. It was about the primacy of the politics. The state can control the market. The vote should matter. But if you have a kind of a less intellectual community, how this should operate, how you're going to have to this bridging, where in a certain way rethinking should take part on both sides. Because you're not going to go back to 1970s. You never can go back anywhere, for good or bad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but this is, I mean, you know, and yeah, and of course, this is, you know, people, you know, liberals, you know, worry about the return of the 1930s, and that is often the reason given for kind of, you know, we must not give the, you know, this kind of return of somewhere power must be crushed. You know, the Anthony Graylings. Well, if you know the British debate, you know, we must not give an inch. You know, we must. Brexit is a disaster. You know, we must kind of reinstitute untrammeled anywhere power, and a lot of it is, I think, premised on an assumption that we can slip back to the 1930s. I think for all sorts of reasons that is. I mean, you can never say never, but I think it is so improbable. I mean, for various reasons. I mean, we are much older societies. You know, the European societies that produced the disasters of the 1930s were very young societies. They had lots of young men roaming the streets, many of them traumatized from their experiences in the First World War. We have a few people traumatized from their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I mean, we're talking about a tiny, tiny number. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, you know, walking these streets. We are much richer than we were in the 1930s. And I think, you know, notwithstanding people's sort of gut connections that still exist and that they value, we're also, that sits alongside kind of a sense of embedded rights that everybody has. And, you know, including minority rights of various kinds. I mean, I have this argument, you know, your triangulation about liberal and democracy, the two parts of the term coming apart. I think there's much more evidence in my technocratic depoliticization, much more evidence for undemocratic liberals than there is for illiberal Democrats. I mean, you know, the burkini ban, you know, collapsed in giggles. You know, okay, the Swiss have banned the building of new minarets, which is inconvenient for Swiss Muslims. But I mean, there is no, you know, the open society is not under threat. I think the triangulation doesn't work. I mean, because it's only on, or almost entirely on one side. And the only argument for, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about illiberal Democrats, but there isn't very much evidence for it. And I think, you know, and that is where I think the 1930s example is, you know, is wrong, really. I think, you know, I think we live in such different. I'm sorry, I didn't really answer.
No, I'll go to Warski-Delsky, but just on one thing I agree very much, and the major difference is that we do not have political powers that believe in the transformative power of violence, which was very typical both for the. On the other side, it's nationally specific. When you're saying basically that you don't feel this, probably in Britain, talk to some Poles or Hungarians, they're going to tell you different stories. So from this point of view, trying to universalize British experiences also could be a tricky.
That is true. And there is a kind of, there is a British complacency, perhaps. I mean, the British are, you know, because of the good fortune we've had historically in some ways, you know, we can be complacent about these things. And I, when I say these things, I am often accused, perhaps rightly, of being complacently British.
We are going to another Brits to start the first question, and then you'll, so Warski-Delsky.
Well,
Robert.
of course, I do agree with you very strongly, both in your analysis, and I think the liberal elites have been criminally neglectful of a large section of a people who it's their duty to protect against misfortune. So I say that. So then one comes immediately to what could be done about it, might be done about it. I don't think there is a solution. I mean, the diagnosis seems to me clear, but when people talk about solutions, they immediately become very, very weak, because they're still really trying to operate within some liberal parameters that don't actually afford solutions. I mean, you'd really start to have to question things like globalization, automation, and some of the and the speed of cultural transformation, which goes ahead full tilt, regardless of what people feel about it, or a lot of people feel about it. So within that world, I don't really see there's much solution, nor is there a solution to be had on through the radical right or the populists. I agree with David on that. I don't think we're re-entering a fascist world, thank goodness. So there's not going to be, except locally maybe, a real pushback from conservative forces. So what's going to happen? Well, the answer is that the economy, the world economy, is very, very flaky. And the next steps will not come, actually, from new coalitions, which are formed because people share these diagnoses, but from an economic collapse. I mean, there will be a succession of economic collapses. This is not a system that can remain free from collapse. It is extremely fragile. There is a huge maldistribution of income. The financial system has not recovered properly, and insofar as it's booming, it's accentuating exactly the same sort of fragility that led to the last collapse. That is where things are going to change again. Now, what the political fallout of all that will be, I don't know. But to my mind, you know, if you take economics seriously, you've got to start with saying, look, globalization was carried out too far, too fast. In the European Union, the attempt to create a free market with all these freedoms without a state, a democratic state, was a catastrophic error. It was an error. And, you know, that's got to be conceded. Now they try to repair it in a feeble way. We must have a minister of finance, we must have this, you know. But of course, it runs up against, you know, a block in the. Anyway, I've gone on enough. But I mean, all I'm saying is rather pessimistic in the end, that it's events, dear boy, as Harold Macmillan, one of our notable prime ministers, said, well, what's going to happen? What you're going to do, it's events, dear boy, that'll decide.
My colleague Ivan Vejvoda was telling me that in 1968 in Paris, one of the famous slogans was, God is dead, Marx is dead, and I don't feel well too. So I do believe we are very much in this situation. So please, any type of questions, interventions, yeah, please.
Hello, I've not read all of your book, but I read the chapter on London, where I notice you didn't mention the riots of 2011, which Nick Clegg and much of the rest of the British elite found themselves being very surprised about that. You did have on your cover of Prospect in 2005 the bombers of London. So one gets the impression that the British elite is often caught unawares by things like the London bombings, the London riots, and Brexit. So what are really the English worse at? Predicting things or shooting penalties against the Germans?
Well, we can be bad at both, I think. I'm surprised I didn't mention it at all, but because it was a very significant event in many ways, and I'd stopped editing Prospect at that time, but I wrote something for the Prospect website about the riots, and I think I think the piece was headlined something like the Anglo-Caribbean tragedy. Now, it wasn't just about people from the Caribbean, but kind of quite a lot of the spark for the riots was in Tottenham, which is a mainly black Caribbean part of London. The Caribbeans have had a very sort of kind of, well, every ethnic group that comes to Britain obviously has its own story, but it's been a very sort of odd one, and British people, I think, feel a mixture of sort of affection and guilt towards the Caribbeans. They've done very badly, and it's a very interesting question why they've done so badly in Britain. You know, why are they still, you know, living in, or you know, many of them living in relative poverty in inner city Britain. And I think there are all sorts of explanations for that. I mean, I think it is partly to do with the combination of very high expectations when they came. I mean, we're going through this again. We're having an argument in Britain about why so many people, mainly from Caribbean backgrounds, have been threatened with deportation because they don't have any way of proving their status in the country. But it goes back to the fact that they, particularly the people who came in the 40s, late 40s and 50s, they were British citizens. Many of their island nations hadn't yet become independent, so they came with great expectations, very high expectations. You might almost say unfairly high expectations of the mother country, and you know, instead of receiving an embrace, many, not all, but many of them kind of received a punch in the face. And great hostility, and that, you know, created a sense of disappointment and resentment that has kind of flowed down the generations. I mean, it's a complex and difficult and sensitive subject, but there is I think that is sort of part of the story behind the very, very strong feelings that were evoked by the incident that sparked the riots, which was the killing of a young guy, sort of semi-underworld figure. I mean, I don't think anybody would say he was an angel, but there are questions about whether it was necessary to shoot him dead. Anyway, that sparked a huge amount of resentment. That led to the riots. I mean, I think it's kind of perhaps a legitimate criticism. It's a certainly legitimate criticism. The failure to predict Brexit, you know, just shows. I think that is a good example of what you're implying, that the elite, in both perhaps a narrow and a broad sense, don't really understand their own country. They don't know what's going on in their own country. The riots is another example where I think you might say that. I think the London bombings, I think, is a little bit harsh. I mean, you know, you can never predict, you know, a couple of crazy people want to blow people up. I mean, you know, we knew there was Muslim extremism, there was, you know, disaffection. But I take the point on the both on the Brexit vote and the London riots. I think they are both examples of kind of elite detachment.
Thank you. Please. There is there, and then let's see. Yeah, David.
I'm staying up. So, thank you. My question would be, you mentioned in the beginning that you think this populist wave is sort of a rational reaction to certain developments, and I wondered, and you also said your argument wasn't dichotomous, but to me it sort of seemed, because I wondered, can you not be in favor of diversity and have a socio-culturally liberal attitude, but still be very much in favor of regulating the economy? I mean, the leftist position, quite simply put. And so if a rational reaction would perhaps have been voting for someone like Bernie Sanders, but not for someone like Donald Trump. And I think if we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, are these people worried about the undemocratic structure of the economy, or are they more worried about issues like people with different skin colors and different sexual orientations? And I think there has to be this sort of third possible position at least taken into account.
Yeah. Shall I answer?
Yeah. And then after that, we're going to collect questions to be sure that.
I mean, I think this. Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it goes to the heart of the way in which sort of left-right politics have got out of sync with and don't really work in an age of socio-cultural politics, because the left wants to control the economy, and it wants the society and the culture to be as open as possible, and I suppose you might say the right wants the other way round. That they believe still more in controlling immigration and national social contracts, but they want a much more open economy. And I think it is, who was it? Daniel Bell, the famous American political scientist, who said, his political credo was, I think he actually said, I'm a social democrat. Yeah, well,
liberal in politics and conservative in culture.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I would slightly rephrase it and say, he's a kind of market-friendly social democrat in economics. After all, he wasn't American, and a liberal in politics, and somewhat conservative on cultural and social matters. And I would say that is where the majority of people in most of our societies are. But for all sorts of historical and contingent reasons, no political party has ever emerged to capture that combination. Perhaps David Owen's SDP, of which Lord Skidelsky was a prominent member, might have been that party back in the early 1980s. Although I think the Liberals would have probably won the argument there too. But being able to combine sort of centrist, left of centre views on economics with a respect for small c conservatism and social conservatism has never really happened, and perhaps that's what should happen, what might happen. I do think it's slightly. I mean, I think there are places in Europe where I think the anywhere somewhere schism is less powerful. That's mainly because anywheres are more respectful or perhaps frightened of somewheres, or the system forces them to, or gives somewheres voice. I mean, I'm thinking of Germany and perhaps indeed Austria too. Obviously, you have a very powerful populist party in government, so perhaps that is also part of the answer. Not being frightened of populists in power, so long as they're legitimate populists. I don't think we don't talk enough about the divide between legitimate and illegitimate populism, and I think we should. But the sorry, I've slightly lost my thread. But voice for people who feel excluded is an important thing, and if we want somewheres to have parties they can vote for that aren't perhaps populist parties, that have that kind of Daniel Bell combination, and we don't seem to have them. I mean, perhaps the Conservative Party after Brexit has been sort of nudging a little bit in that direction, but then got a bit of a bloody nose at the 2017 election.
My suggestion is, because I saw 4 persons who are interested to talk. Let's get all the questions, 5, and then you're going to have the final. Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Glad that you're here. Just one word. He was a former deputy editor-in-chief of Die Presse and correspondent of for Central Europe of the FAZ. And he used to be a liberal, but I'm not quite sure whether you still are.
It's a difficult question. I'm not ready to discuss it. Well, I like the last chapter of your book. I don't think it's the weakest one. I understood it as a kind of, let's say, an introduction for the next book to come, no? Where you could elaborate the political propositions. In the center of your propositions, if I understood it well, is that there is no other way than to integrate the legitimate populism in the political game. Now, okay, if we look at that and if we see how the parties behave, now particularly the leftist parties, wherever in the United States as well as in continental Europe and in the UK, if it is Corbyn, if it is Renzi, if it is Kern, if it is Nales, whatever, it seems that they don't understand the reaction of the electorate. So you would expect them to move in a direction to accept this kind of legitimate populism, but no, they're concentrating on marginalized groups, on diversity, and so on. No? Yeah. Now, what is it? What is the reason for that? Is it that let's say, that they are so shaped in their anywhere cultural model, no, that they don't even understand what's going on? Or is it, and I think that could be also the problem, that the whole political class, in the sense of Pareto and Mosca, is leaving the democratic contest. So they say, whatever the people vote, we don't care because we want to continue this kind of policy we have been following before.
Thank you. Yeah. Susanna, then, there was Susanna, and then two questions here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm from Hungary, and I read your book, or actually an article a couple of years ago, with great interest. And you wrote on Britain, but actually I found it very telling and enlightening, also in Central European context. So I'm very happy that I could finally meet you. My problem is, again, with the settlement part, because I am an anywhere liberal. And I try to be very empathetic and learning what you wrote about somewheres. The problem what I have is that very often somewheres are represented in the politics by anywheres. Yeah. Very highly educated people, globally aware, and actually they use this demand of somewheres for very pragmatic way, I would say. So it's not their own identity, but they take it and it's working. And because they understand it as a political war. And this is where my problem is with the settlement, that if these anywheres and somewheres are moral tribes represented politically by actually anywheres as a war, then why would somewheres, or those who represent somewheres, would like to settle when they are on the winning side?
Yeah, Desi and then Ivan.
Just squeeze in, because my question is also about this new settlement that is needed, and it relates to the question of Ivan, which was, as I understood it, what would be the voice of the somewheres and what would be their vision for a future or a future settlement. So my question is, do you think that we can look at Brexit actually as the voice of the somewhere and as their proposal for a new settlement? Because in a way it does something very important, that it reappropriates parts of the political, which used to be political, then went to Brussels, to the expert level, and this was a vote to bring it back to politics. So isn't this the vision of the somewheres about the new settlement, actually?
Yes, I'm Ivan Vevoda, another permanent fellow here at the Institute, and as Desi was asking her question, my mind reminded me that, in fact, the somewheres historically would go out into the street and ask for their rights throughout the 19th century, the workers' movement, those left behind, or the Popular Front in France later in the 30s. But I think that this process has been going on for a very long time, and that actually people went along because there were benefits from globalization. To be very colloquial, I mean, it was cheaper to buy a T-shirt from China costing £1 than one produced in England that you would buy for £10. And so all ships were rising, and it was fair weather. I remember coming to Britain in '93 from war-torn Yugoslavia to teach at Sussex, and it was the whole affair of selling Rover to BMW in Germany. And there were all these very kind of somewhere arguments, how can we sell a pearl of British industry to you-know-who, and what will we do to us? And one of your colleague journalists on radio said, well, madam, to a question, he said, well, actually, this car is composed of lights from Spain, of seats from Italy, whatever, electrics from Germany. So it's, for a long time, it's not been an English car, even though we see it as that. What I want to say by that is to go along with your argument that leadership has been not only complacent, but hasn't done the work of explaining what was going on, going out to these people and to explain that, yes, this is where it's going, whether it's a TINA, there is no alternative or not. If we are to survive, if you want to keep that job at Rover and not close the factory down, we need to bring in BMW or the Chinese. And we're seeing that in other European countries, the Chinese buying 10% of Daimler with 10 billion. So I think that's a key part, a fault, and obviously the deregulation of the market. And you didn't mention Thatcher, I think, although clearly she's part of the problem being a conservative, the whole Thatcherite thing. And a very simple question for a non-Brit, but who follows. How does the left and Corbyn, what does he think? I mean, what's he thinking? And it's part of the settlement, because a lot of young people, from what I gather, are part of the backing that he's getting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's some really all very interesting, good questions. As it's kind of freshest in my mind, let me answer you first. Or respond. There are no answers, obviously. But I think much of what you say is right, and I think it's an important point that about the failure of leadership, and Robert referred to it earlier. And I think that does have to do with a sort of a kind of anywhere bubble complacency thinking, going back to my tribe. I mean, when I wrote that article, I became aware of my tribe, the tribe, as I was kind of half leaving it, and I think the tribe has had far too little self-awareness. And did not go out and explain why, in this complex world, we will benefit, at least eventually. I go right back to what I said at the beginning: the complacency of the Robert Reich, sort of Tony Blair, roll with globalization and it'll all be fine, lads. And it wasn't all fine. A lot of the, we shouldn't. The temptation is, when talking about somewhere, to just assume it's the kind of left-behind working class in the Midlands, the north of England, or whatever your equivalents here are. It isn't just that. They form an important part of it. There are lots of quite rich people who are also somewheres. There are middle-class people who are somewheres. There are, people of strong religious belief, who also feel themselves at an angle to the dominant secular liberal humanist worldview. I don't know, I've got a holiday home in the West Country in Cornwall. The farmers nearby me are often, they complain the whole time, like farmers do, but, they go on skiing holidays, and they have a Range Rover in the garage, and they read the Daily Mail. but they are very rooted people who have socially conservative views. So it isn't just the left behind working class, but it's perhaps particularly them who feel who their party went off somewhere else, essentially. Nobody was explaining to them why actually being a member of the European Union in the long run was a good thing for them. And I mean, and to your point, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this kind of slightly bizarre politics, you might say, of the modern left is sort of sociologically obvious. The modern left, I mean, probably here too, but completely in Britain, is being taken over by liberal graduates. Centre-left parties are liberal graduate parties. That's what they are. I mean, you know, and most of the working class doesn't even vote for them, let alone join them, become party members. I mean, there are a few, obviously, who both vote for them and maybe members in some of the old sort of industrial heartland areas. And I think it is much, I mean, it is much harder for highly ideological, highly educated, liberal graduate cadres of these parties to shift to the right on cultural issues. They would rather die than accept, you know, I don't know, a more natalist family policy, or you know, really tight restrictions on immigration. And actually, this is why we are going to be ruled by the centre-right forever, because it's much easier, and indeed we saw this at the last election in the UK, it's much easier for the right to move left on economics than it is for the left to move right on culture. That is why Jeremy Corbyn will never be in number 10 Downing Street, or it is one of the reasons why he will never be in number 10 Downing Street. And I don't think, I mean, you're right that obviously, almost by definition, the leaders of parties are anywheres. You were kind of slightly implying that there's a sort of cynicism about the anywheres who lead somewheres. And no doubt there is, but I mean, there's cynicism, a degree of cynicism in all political elites, I think, isn't there? I mean, there is cynicism on anywheres who lead anywheres too. But I think apart from the charlatans and the cynics, I mean, I think there are possible settlements, and I think Brexit is the beginning of a settlement. And perhaps I was too unkind to my final chapter. I mean, there are lots of things that we can do, and actually, unless we give away all the freedoms, which I fear we may do before we leave the European Union, there are lots of things that are easier now to do than they would have been when we were still in the European Union. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of Brexit. For me, I mean, I would still regard myself as a social democrat. I mean, I'd kind of rather go along with the Daniel Bell combination, but I would certainly regard myself as a social democrat still. One of the paradoxes of Brexit is that it's an opportunity to break out of this UK growth model, which I described earlier, which is essentially, you know, derived from the great. I mean, there's a lot to be said for flexible labour markets. Don't get me wrong, but they do tend to kind of bias your economy in a certain way, and that combination of and we've been we are a kind of low productivity, lowish wage economy because of the flexible labour market plus stuffing as many people into jobs as possible. You know, we are an amazing machine for creating jobs. You know, we have been employer of last resort for the whole of blinking Europe. To break out of that pattern, oddly enough, we have to leave in order to have a more European-style economy that actually invests more in people, we have to leave the European Union. So one might argue, anyway. And I think we can start doing that. Indeed, I'm a bit exasperated that so much of the discussion in Britain has been about, partly because anywheres obviously dominate the discussion, even post-Brexit. Brexit has been an enormous rebalancing of power between anywheres and somewheres, as you say, a hugely important rebalancing of power. But of course, the ball goes back into the anywhere court as soon as the somewheres have stuffed their ballots in the referendum box. And you see that the entire debate in Britain is dominated by economistic Remainers. We're arguing about whether we're going to be £500 poorer in 7 years' time as a result of Brexit, or we're arguing constantly about trade arrangements. What kind of customs union we might have. And then actually what we should be talking about is the fact that we can actually have a proper regional and industrial policy now in Britain if we leave the European Union. I mean, if we want to rebooting Britain after Brexit, there are lots of things we can do. We can sort out, indeed we'll have to sort out, assuming that we end freedom of movement, particularly for lower skilled workers, we will have to sort out our middling skill gap. I mean, it's absolutely awful. Half the construction workers in London come from other European Union countries, and I think we had something like 8,000 construction apprenticeships starting last year for the whole of blinking Britain. We're meant to be building 250,000 houses a year because there's been no pressure on government or employers. Employers have had a massive free lunch over free movement. I mean, and you can see it in the figures. They spend about a third less on training their workforce now than they did 15 years ago. It's an absolute scandal, and we will now be able to do something about that. We need to sort out the institutions. At the moment, we've created far too many universities. The whole anywhere bias in the system towards the kind of classic 3-year academic degree that is taught by academics who would far prefer to be doing their own research than actually teaching the kids. We need institutions possibly like the American community colleges or the German Fachhochschule, the kind of middling sort of beyond apprenticeship level, but not universities. And we don't have any of those. We're going to have to start creating them. Because otherwise, we're going to collapse. We could do all sorts of things on family life, for example. I mean, our family policy is we spend £9 billion a year, I think, on childcare. And if you want to look after your own child, you can't get a penny of it. I mean, our family policy is essentially making it as easy as possible for both parents to spend as little time in the family as possible. And that, again, is a very anywhere presumption, I think. The prioritisation of the public realm over the private realm. Like I say, somewheres, male or female somewheres don't want to go back to the 1950s. They don't want women to go back to the kitchen. But they do still think there is such a thing as the gender division of labour, and that when women have young children, they actually want to look after them most of the time. And our system makes it quite hard to do that, because people don't earn high enough wages so that the woman has to go out of work, etc., etc. I mean, all of that we could do. Like I say, we could have a proper, if we have extraordinary gulfs in wealth and income between our different regions, and if we're really serious about wanting the Northeast to get richer or South Wales to get richer, then we need to have radical regional policy. We need to be able to say, any company setting up in this region won't pay corporation tax for 5 years or 10 years or something. As I say, we can't do that inside the European Union, and we ought to be able to, or rather, we will be able to do it now. I think there are some, quite, perhaps final point, there are some optimistic trends here too, I think. That there are the sort of trends that in a way work in favour of more somewhere intuitions than anywhere intuitions, you might say. I mean, I think the next round of, somewheres have already, working class somewheres have already taken the big hit on mechanisation and automation. I mean, the next big hit from AI is going to come to the sort of slightly lower level anywhere professional jobs, isn't it? It's going to automate, accountancy and law and some aspects of medicine. So that in itself might make anywheres a little bit more sensitive to economic shocks and rapid social change and how unpleasant it is. But also, I think as we get older as societies, there'll be much more stress on caring functions and emotional intelligence and things other than other than cognitive ability. We have become so, like I said, the idea cognitive ability is the kind of gold standard of human esteem. I think it's been a very destructive aspect of development in recent decades. Actually, and someone wrote me a letter. Someone who'd read my book wrote me a letter, which I kind of want to make the subject of my next book, and said that a good society is one in which you have a kind of equal balance between the three H's. It sounds a bit naff, but actually I think it's sort of true, that the head, the hand, and the heart. When he said heart, I mean, he was kind of meaning emotional intelligence, really. We were talking about the labour market and the kind of jobs of the future, and to be a good, to work in medicine, or either as a doctor or a nurse, or to be really good at that job, you do have to have a degree of emotional intelligence. Similarly with social care functions, many educational functions. So I think we may have a kind of a rebalancing of the three H's as a result of these trends that are happening anywhere. At least I hope we do.
Thank you very much. I do believe that we all get some sense of somewhere. Thank you very very much, and also I hope that we also contributed to the next book.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.